We undoubtedly live in an age of knowledge, where the power of our intellect, of our ability to think, holds primacy. We've built a globalized system of co-aligned cultures and sense-making institutions that allow us to live in and understand an incredibly sophisticated world. I was a chemistry major back in university, and this taught me a few things. Firstly, that reality is incredibly complicated. And secondly, searching for what is most foundationally true when we're trying to understand something is the most important thing that we can do. If we did not look at molecules, we would not understand biology and we would not understand life. If we did not look at atoms, we would not understand molecules. And if we did not look at protons and electrons, we would not understand those atoms. And then furthermore, if we didn't look at things like electromagnetism, we wouldn't understand them either. That process of looking deeper for answers, of working your way down the chain of logic, is a process known as first principles. It's why we have science, and it's why we understand the world at all. Take any figure that you know that occupies an intellectual or educational space. Almost certainly at some point they'll have told their listeners just how important it is that they know how to think. Not just what to think, but how to think. To be critical and analytical, to free yourself from bias and be dispassionate, to be logical and systematic, to be clever. And first principles thinking plays a key role in this picture. In a world where it's becoming increasingly difficult to know what's true, to pass through the deluge of information that we receive on social media and through other sources, I want to familiarize you with first principles thinking so that you know how to pass through it all and that you get an idea of how to begin to think about things, for example, like a scientist might, so that you can then apply first thinking principles to your own life and to see if the people around you are doing so as well, or if instead they are stopping halfway. I'm Lucian McCaig, and this is Rigorous Wisdom. Now let's get into the video. First principles thinking is a problem-solving or reasoning method that breaks complex ideas down into their most fundamental parts. That is, the basic truths that can't be reduced any further, and then building up from those foundational truths rather than simply relying on assumptions or analogies to build our understanding. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle was the first to formalize this idea in his work on logic and metaphysics, and he called this process first principles. In every systematic inquiry, where there are first principles, causes, or elements, knowledge and science result from acquiring knowledge of these. In other words, true knowledge on any given topic relies on understanding the foundational truths behind that subject, because of course everything is interrelated and interconnected, and some things sit on top of others in terms of doing the work to explain those things. Let's imagine a ladder or a pyramid for a second. We can't, or we don't want to, start our reasoning halfway up or at the top of that ladder. That's not where its foundations are. We need to start from the very bottom with the most foundational truths that we can, and then begin logically and consistently layering our knowledge on top of that, using, again, the best knowledge that we have available to us, that has itself hopefully been derived in a process like that one. And that's really all there is to it conceptually. It's something that's probably best understood through example, or by being acted out. Now I'm going to walk through an example of first principles thinking, which I think is particularly instructive and just generally informative. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I am fascinated by human behavior. Now let's take a knowledge claim. And for the sake of this video and for time, I'm going to have to simplify down a lot of nuanced elements for this example and leave out a fair bit of background explaining. So of course there is more to this than I'm about to explain, but it's the general gist of things. Now let's say that an individual observes that babies, people, grow up in a social context and that they learn from that context or that environment, and thus concludes that, well, people must be solely products of that environment. That is, their personality, their behavior, who they are, their identities, their whole body, their self, is a product of that social circumstance in which they were raised. And this was a perspective that was somewhat common last century in particular, but it still remains. It's called the blank slate theory and is what you might think of as a social constructivist view. Now, in this scenario, is that person that has made that observation using first principles to determine a theory about the human condition, in particular about human behavior and human development? Now remember, our guiding ethic here is that we need to look at the foundations of a situation, at what begins to explain it at the smallest level possible, the smallest, most true fundamental level possible, so that we don't begin our analysis and our understanding on shaky ground that could be undercut by something else. Now, to do this, to begin thinking from first principles, we can ask questions that allow us to disseminate that claim. And those questions might be, what plays a role in human development and behavior? And what influences that process? Remember, we want to get as foundational here as we can. We want to use as much foundational knowledge as possible. And before I now begin to answer that question, I should just say that all the claims that I'm about to make are supported by modern psychology, neuroscience, and biology. So let's begin to answer these questions then. So as I said, first principles reasoning requires you to get to the heart of an issue or the bottom of the issue and be as foundational as you can. And when we're talking about people, about the human condition, we can't get more foundational than things like biology and springing from that neuroscience and psychology. Generally speaking, the physical and biological sciences are always a good place to start when we're talking about people and we're trying to get to the bottom of things. Now, you might think, though, that what we're talking about here is social dynamics or a social issue, but it's not. What we're actually talking about with this question is humans and what affects them. So then to begin with, we should take a look at what we know about humans. Humans are fundamentally animals. We're living creatures, organisms. We're made up of organs and muscles and bones and, most importantly, a brain that controls all of that. We know that our brain is where our humanness resides. Without our brain, we are nothing. We know that not only does our brain control our body, but it controls our mind. Our brain and our mind are the same thing. Turn that brain off and we turn off. Damage that brain and we change. Flood that brain with the right chemicals and you could be suddenly happy, sad, angry, aggressive, or aroused. Our ability to think, to move, to feel is all dependent on our brain. The human condition is situated very much in here in our head. Now, we also know that our brain just didn't appear like that out of nowhere. Most animals have brains, and those brains tend to differ between species. Why? Because of something called evolution. We know from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution that we are the products of a long primate and mammalian ancestry. We also know that our evolution is guided by a process known as natural selection. That is, those individuals that possessed physical or mental traits that aided in their survival passed on those traits to their offspring, resulting in those traits becoming present in the population across time, so long as they were still useful for survival and didn't adapt into something else. Such traits might include long symmetrical legs, broader hips for successful childbirthing, an agreeable demeanor that allowed for cooperation within a group, aggressiveness that allowed for successful hunting, and love when rearing children. In a strangely less well understood process, our evolution was guided by something called sexual selection. That is, men and women co-evolved, selecting for traits within one another that facilitated or optimized for sexual reproduction, successful reproduction. Again, both our bodies and our minds, who we are, what we are, was shaped by that process. So now we know that our brain and our minds are the same thing, and that our brain controls our behavior. We also know that our brains are the product of evolution. They were shaped by that process across millennia. We know that the brains of each species contain genetic data that on average allow for or led to successful reproduction and survival in the environment. This means that they were not blank slates. They were, in a fashion, pre-wired to act, think, and feel in such a way that favored survival and reproductive success. Our DNA provided a blueprint of what this thing should look like and how it should be wired, going off the information provided to it across millennia, millions of years even of evolutionary history. Take birds, for example. A bird doesn't learn how to fly, how to navigate the air and the winds, and how to hunt, let's say, through instruction or just simply observing other birds. It learns how to fly and do all of these things through natural instinct and practice. Likewise, a stallion hasn't taken lessons on how to get it on with a mare. It just knows what to do. And so does that mare. We follow the same evolutionary path as everyone else. We are thus likewise pre-wired with genetic data spanning millennia. Now that's not to say that we are utterly pre-wired. The wiring of a child's brain doesn't predict exactly what that child will be like 50 years from its birth, but it will influence the course of that child's development in conjunction with its environment. Our brains incline us towards things. Our intelligence, our creativity, our personality, our interests, who we find attractive, what we want to do, etc., etc. And of course our brains still rely on the external environment for learning. There are horrible cases like Genie Wiley where young children were deprived of sensory experience and stimulation early on in their development, resulting in abnormalities in their brain and then just their cognitive development in general. But the stimulus we receive from our environment is still filtered through the genetically blueprinted neuronal webs of our brain. Our nature needs nurture to survive, which makes sense because we evolved with both playing their part. But the claim that human behavior is best understood or should be primarily understood through social influence is wrong. That would be to observe a broader social phenomena or circumstance and to reason as if it were the foundation. But in reality, we need to determine what influences that social phenomena, which is human behavior, which is determined by the brain. To work from first principles, we must reason to an understanding of an issue using axiomatic information. Humans are products of biology. Our brain and mind are the same thing. Our brain influences our behavior, and evolution means genetic learning and the passing on of traits. Our brains are products of evolution, and our brains are thus, to an extent, pre-wired. We are rarely, if ever, mindless products of our social circumstance. Now, I hope you managed to stay with me through all of that. It was a long example, but it was a good one, I think. Now, let's quickly look at one more example of first principles thinking that is a little less abstract this time and a bit more applied, let's say, to the real world. When entrepreneur Elon Musk first created his company, SpaceX, the conventional thinking at the time was that rockets were so expensive because aerospace parts were so expensive on the open market, proving a barrier to entry. However, by breaking down the issue, Elon was able to prove that this was in fact a false barrier to entry. He did this by asking the following questions. Firstly, what are the raw materials required to make a rocket? Like aluminium, carbon fiber, titanium, etc. What do those raw materials themselves actually cost on the commodity market? Not the parts, but the raw materials that make up the parts. And lastly, why not just buy the raw materials and make the parts ourselves? SpaceX discovered that the actual price of raw materials was only 2% of the total rocket cost. In that way, they reasoned beyond the analogous idea that parts had to be purchased from a supplier, allowing them to instead drastically reduce costs by building in-house. Now, I mentioned at the start of this video that first principles reasoning allows for respect, which I emphasized was quite important. And The reason for that is because it signals a kind of intellectual honesty. First principles thinking, when done properly, indicates that you have genuinely tried to follow a course of logic and determine what you think using all of the resources and information available to you, and not just to you, but to everyone else, what we have that is commonly agreed upon. You are not simply reasoning using facts or ideas that are convenient to you or that just support your argument. In a case like this, you're probably also adhering to scientific frameworks and ways of thinking. You're not just trying to win and be right or to manipulate and deceive. You're trying to get it right. You're arguing in good faith. A good example of this in the public sphere, I think, would be between the intellectual figures Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris. Ben Shapiro is a religious Republican, and Sam Harris is an atheistic Democrat. Two opposing forces, you might think. Now, both parties often disagree with one another on politics and on the existence of God and the value of religion. But from their discussions, it's clear both still respect each other. Sam has himself said that he recognizes that Ben is trying to reason from first principles, being as axiomatic and scientific as possible. He does not, for example, simply just try to impose the existence of God or the value of religion as being self-evident. He actually tries to put in the work logically to prove why those things are true, why he thinks those things are true. And a world in which disagreeing parties can still talk to one another is a world in which we can make progress and ultimately find resolutions to problems instead of just always being at odds and not listening to one another just because we think they're wrong. So the next time that you find yourself wondering whether a particular idea or claim is true, just ask yourself this: have I approached this from a point of first principles? Do I think the other person has approached this from a point of first principles? Is there more to this story? Have I got all of my foundations right? Have I missed some key bit of crucial knowledge that actually does a lot more explaining than I myself have done? In many ways, there is nothing worse in this world that we can do for ourselves and as a collective than to think and believe things simply because it's easy to do so, convenient, or suits our goals. We should always, if possible, examine every kind of knowledge claim that we or other people make with care and logical rigor. As always, thanks for watching. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe for any more that might come your way. Oh, and please feel free to suggest any topics that you'd like me to cover as well. Thank you.